The year was 480 BC. And a massive Persian army marched with determination to face the rebel forces of Athens and its Greek allies. Persia against the Greek powers. Ancient sources number the size of the Persian army at 1 million soldiers. Modern historians cut the number down a bit and say the army numbered perhaps upwards of several 100,000. In any case, Persia is putting on a massive military display. At the time, the Persian Empire stretched from modern-day Libya and Africa all the way to Pakistan and Asia. It was the largest empire in history, the second great empire after the Babylonians. The best we can tell, there were about 50 million people living in the Persian Empire of that day. They had conquered the Babylonian Chaldean Empire in 539 BC, and the Persians had settled in to dominate the Middle Eastern world. And their empire lasted for 200 years before they were replaced by the Greeks. But initially, the regions of Greece had been conquered by the Persians under Darius, and that would be back in 550 and following. Darius's armies had been defeated by the Athenians at the famous Battle of Marathon in 490. Enraged, Darius was determined to subdue his Greek enemies. He amasses a great army. He's going back and he's going to pay the Greeks for winning the battle at Marathon, that famous battle where a Greek soldier ran 26 miles, and that is where we get the distance of modern-day marathons. So King Darius had great intentions to satisfy his thirst for vengeance against the Greeks. However, he died before he could fulfill his wishes, and the quest for revenge fell to his son. His son's name was Xerxes, and there's some very famous battles which took place under his reign, under his rule. The Battle of Thermopylae and the 300 Spartans. The Battle of Salamis, where the Persian navy is completely obliterated by the Greeks. Now, what does all of this have to do with the book of Esther? Well, it has to do with the book of Esther, because the emperor, whom the Greeks called Xerxes, that I've been talking about, had a different name in Persia. In your English Bible, it's Ahasuerus. And that's the name you're going to find him listed under in the book of Esther. We find him described there in Esther chapter 1 and verse 1. These events took place during the days of Ahasuerus, who ruled 127 provinces from India to Cush. The king in the book of Esther is none other than Xerxes, the son of Darius, who fought the Greeks and ultimately lost the Persian Empire to the Greeks. This is the man who tried to conquer Greece with 250,000 soldiers. This is the man, the king in the book of Esther, who becomes the ruler of that empire after the death of his father. My friends, I want you to understand that the Bible does not happen in obscurity. It does not take place in Never Never Land. It does not begin once upon a time in a land far, far away. The Bible was written by real people inspired by God who lived real lives in real places and faced real problems just like you and I do. But their stories, like our stories, are all part of His story. The working out of God's plan and the establishment of His kingdom. You see, my friends, you are not here by accident. And I am not here by accident. It is no accident that this church is here. That the Lord has called us to do the things He's called us to do. For we are all part of His plan and part of His kingdom. Several years into the reign of Ahasuerus or Xerxes, the book of Esther opens with a 6-month summit. The king is showing off his stuff. But he's also holding a council of war, making plans to return to Greece. And after 6 months, there is a party. Look there again, if you will, please, verse 5. At the end of this time, the king held a week-long banquet in the garden courtyard of the royal palace for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were present in the fortress of Susa. At the end of 6 months, the king holds a week-long banquet where all the folks in the city are invited. In the midst of this drunken party, the king commands that the queen be brought before him. He wants to show off her beauty. He wants to show off his trophies. And she refuses to come before this drunken orgy of a party. And so the king, in his anger, demotes her from queen. Now, there in chapter 2 and verse 16, we read, Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in the royal palace in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. 4 years have now passed since the banquet. The kingdom has been without a queen for 4 years. Why did it take so long? It was during this time that the king again unsuccessfully attempted to defeat Greece. And he's returned home to lick his wounds, to take his mind off his defeats. And he begins to think, after 4 years, about his kingdom and his nation being without a queen. So we read there in chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Sometime later, when King Ahasuerus, his rage had cooled down, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what was decided against her. The king's personal attendant suggests, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in each province of his kingdom so that they may assemble all the beautiful young virgins to the harem at the fortress of Susa. Put them under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and give them the required beauty treatments. Then the young woman who pleases the king will reign in place of Vashti. The suggestion pleased the king, and he did accordingly. There's going to be an empire-wide beauty contest. And we can make a sort of a general assumption that if there are roughly 50 million people in this empire, that there would be roughly 25 million women to pick from. Now that's some scene. 25 million women going to be involved in a beauty pageant, a beauty contest. Now, looking there in chapter 2, beginning in verse 5. A Jewish man was in the fortress of Susa named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. He had been taken in exile from Jerusalem with the other captives when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took King Jeconiah of Judah into exile. Mordecai was the legal guardian of his cousin Hadash, that is Esther, because she didn't have a father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. When her father and mother died, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. There was a Jewish man, a captive, who had been brought to the city. He is the cousin and adopted dad of his orphan cousin Esther. Now the Bible doesn't tell us why Esther is an orphan. Perhaps her parents were some of those who were killed in Jerusalem and in Israel at the time that the nation was conquered. The Bible doesn't tell us. But she is an orphan. And Mordecai, her cousin, has adopted her and become her adopted dad. Then, according to verse 16, the king chooses to make Esther his queen. Imagine the odds of this Jewish orphan becoming queen. Of all of the women of the kingdom, historians tell us 400 women were chosen to be brought to the king to go through this beauty treatment program. 400 women out of the whole kingdom. And from these 400 women, the king chose Esther to become his queen. Come a long way. A Cinderella story. A Jewish orphan girl with no mother and no dad, becoming the queen of the largest empire in the world. Now, look, if you will, chapter 2, beginning in verse 21. During those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two eunuchs who guarded the king's entrance, became infuriated and tried to assassinate King Ahasuerus. When Mordecai learned of the plot, he reported it to Queen Esther, and she told the king on Mordecai's behalf. When the report was investigated and verified, both men were hanged on the gallows. This event was recorded in the court's records of daily events in the king's presence. Mordecai hears of a plot to have the king assassinated, tells Esther, who reports it to the king. The king investigates, finds out it's true, and has the bad guys killed. And the whole event is recorded in the court records. Now, chapter 3, verse 1. After all this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman. A man in the kingdom is promoted, and everyone is ordered to bow down before him and to honor him. But of all the people of the kingdom, Mordecai, the adopted dad of the queen, refuses. Every time Haman rides by, Mordecai refuses to honor, refuses to bow down, refuses to acknowledge him. Now, chapter 3, verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him homage, he was filled with rage. And when he learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, Haman decided not to do away with Mordecai alone. He set out to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout Ahasuerus' kingdom. Haman devises a plot to kill not only Mordecai, but all of the Jewish people as well. Why in the world? When one man refuses to honor you, when one man ticks you off, why in the world would you decide to destroy him and everyone of his nation and lineage? Why not settle for just killing the one who upsets you? You see, my friends, Haman was an Agagite. It says that here. It says it again in chapter 8. It says it again in chapter 9. It says Haman the Agagite. It keeps repeating that. That's not a small detail. It is the origin of Haman's hatred for Mordecai and his hatred for the Jews. And to understand why it's important to know that he was an Agagite, let's go back a little bit. Let's go back nearly 1,000 years to the time the Israelites were exiting Egypt, when they're heading toward the Promised Land. In the process of heading toward the Promised Land, they're attacked in the 17th chapter of Exodus by the Amalekites. The Amalekites attack them. The Amalekites are descendants of Esau, the one who sold his birthright. And because the Amalekites attacked the Jews, God cursed them in Deuteronomy chapter 25, and he says one day they're going to be extinct. God pronounces a curse on all the Amalekites. 4 centuries later, King Saul captures or conquers the Amalekites, and he captures their king, and his name is Agag. Saul was supposed to kill King Agag, and he didn't do it. He let him live. And the prophet Samuel came to Saul and he said, "What in the world are you doing? God told you to kill all of those people." And Saul wasn't going to do it. So the Bible tells us that the prophet Samuel took a sword and he cut him to pieces. Haman was related to that king. Haman was an Agagite. And though almost 1,000 years have passed since the curse, and hundreds of years have passed since the hacking to death of his ancestor, Haman knew his family history. And he knew that it was a Jewish man, a Jewish prophet, who had had his royal ancestor killed. So Haman decided he couldn't just kill Mordecai, but he wanted to wipe out all of the Jews. So he has the magicians cast a lot to find out the best time to have all of the Jews killed. And then he tricks the king into signing a law that says on a certain day, the day determined by lot, that all of the Jewish folks all over the kingdom will be killed. that all of the people in the kingdom are to rise out and wipe out every man, woman, and child of Jewish lineage in the entire kingdom. Haman says, I'll have my vengeance. Chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had occurred, he tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes, went into the middle of the city and cried loudly and bitterly. He only went as far as the king's gate, since the law prohibited anyone wearing sackcloth from entering the king's gate. There was great mourning among the Jewish people in every province where the king's command and edict came. They fasted, wept, and lamented, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. The announcement of the coming destruction of all of the Jews, that law was sent out throughout the entire kingdom. That on a certain day all of the Jews were to be destroyed. And the Jews were scared. They began to fast. And they began to pray. And they put on their sackcloth and their ashes, and they began to ask for God's mercy. And the people in the city of Susa were confused. You see, the king did not know that his queen was a Jew. The king did not know that his queen was related to, was part of the people that he had just ordered be destroyed at the prompting of Haman. The king had been tricked, but the people of the city knew. And they said, we don't understand. Word was taken to Queen Esther. Your adopted dad, your cousin, he's laying in the street in sackcloth and ashes. Esther was afraid. She didn't know what in the world could cause Mordecai to do that. So she sent clothes for him to put on. And he refused. And he sent word back to the queen, here is the reason I am in sackcloth and ashes. He said it's because a law has been passed that all of us will be killed. Now look, if you will, chapter 4, verse 10. Esther spoke to Hakoth and commanded him to tell Mordecai, all the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard and who has not been summoned, the death penalty. Only if the king extends the golden scepter will that person live. I have not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. Esther's response was reported to Mordecai. The queen was afraid to go before the king and ask for mercy for her people. Mordecai had told Esther, his cousin, said, you need to appeal to the king on our behalf. You need to ask him to change the law, to change the rules so that we won't be destroyed. And the queen said, I'm afraid to go in front of the king. The law says no man, no woman can come before the king unless he calls for them. And if they do, he will be killed unless the king points his royal scepter to them. And she said, I don't know why, but the king hasn't called on me in 30 days. I'm afraid to go before the king. And she had good reason to be afraid. You see, during the interim, during the 4-year span when there was no queen, the king had again attempted to invade Greece. He had engineers build bridges over a narrow span of ocean water so that his troops could cross over from Turkey and get into Greece. But between the time the bridges were constructed and the soldiers crossed over, a storm came up and all of the bridges were destroyed. The king decided that evidently the engineers had not built the bridges well enough. And so he had all of the engineers in charge of the construction of those bridges, had all of them gathered up, and he had all of their heads cut off. Well, he wasn't happy with that. So he ordered his soldiers to take whips and go into that body of water and to whip the ocean 300 lashes to pay it back for destroying his bridges. And then he had them take shackles and throw them into the ocean to bind the ocean and its waves. And then he had soldiers take red-hot pokers and poke the ocean with the red-hot pokers to get even for destroying his bridges. The king was a crazy man. And he had anger issues. And Queen Esther said, I don't want to go in front of that madman. There's no telling what he might do to me. Mordecai, you don't know what you're asking. Man, the engineers did the best they knew to do. And look what it cost them. But notice, if you will, Mordecai's answer. Mordecai replies in verse 14. If you keep silent at this time, liberation and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's house will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. You can finish reading the rest of Esther later. Suffice it to say that Esther approaches the king. And through a series of events, Haman is hanged. The Jews are spared. And Mordecai is promoted to the second highest position in the kingdom. 2 weeks ago, on March 7th, Jewish folks around the world celebrated, as they do every year, the Feast of Purim, the Feast of Lots, celebrating and remembering the time Haman cast lots to determine the day that they would be destroyed. The same day on which the Jews instead turned and destroyed their enemies. My friends, the Bible is not a book of fables. It is a book that records how God has and does interact with His people. While in college, I was a member at Seminole Community College, now Seminole State College. I was a member of the Invisible Hand Society. It's an economics honorary club which celebrates how the invisible hand of supply and demand operates through our society and our business world. In the book of Esther, God is never mentioned, but His hand of providence is seen in every single tiny detail. His presence is more powerfully and dominantly visible here than maybe in any other story of this complexity in Scripture, though is never mentioned. His providence is at work in filtering down 25 million women to one, a Jewish orphan chosen to be queen. His providence is demonstrated in Mordecai being in a place where he can hear a plot to kill the king. His providence, His power, His superintending sovereignty can be seen in the night that the king can't sleep and decides to read the royal record, and out of all that he could have chosen to have read to him, what is read to him has to do with Mordecai being unrewarded. And even Haman's timing is perfect in the purposes of God. The invisible hand of God is evident everywhere. The absence of God here in this book, I think, is intentional. It is an ingenious strategy by which the writer works to draw the reader to think deeply about how life circumstances are ordered to God's purpose. These are not coincidences. There are too many. They are not random. There is a designer. There is a coordinator. There is a power behind all of this. God literally thunders through the book of Esther. And there are no miracles in the book of Esther, but the whole thing is a miracle of divine providence. People, places, time, action. It's more than miraculous. Not Haman, not Satan using Haman could destroy the people of God, could put an end to the promises God made to Abraham and David, to the promises of the preservation of the nation for the coming Messiah and the ultimate salvation of Israel. No one, no matter how they attempt to destroy the people of God and the purpose of God, can succeed, because God's covenant love for Israel will be fulfilled. And it is being fulfilled. And the message for you is this. While you're going through life and trying to make sure you fix all the little pieces of your life, understand this. That there is over and in, above and below your life, a divine architect ordering every detail. And if you are His, a child of His, Jesus tells us that you rest securely in His hand. And there is no circumstance, no trial, no difficulty that can come your way that God is unaware of. The Lord is still on the throne. These are challenging times. Challenging days we live in. It's easy to become pretty distressed at the way things are going. The way our society is heading. Our world is chaotic, disconcerting, troubling, disturbing, perhaps even distressing, and in some ways frightening. It's not like that in the kingdom. The Bible says God's thoughts are not our thoughts. And all we can see is the bottom of the tapestry. We do not understand the design that He is building. But my friends, I want you to understand that there are no emergency sessions in heaven. The divine architect is ordering our lives. And those of us who belong to Him and are part of His kingdom, He is ordering our lives to His eternal glory, every part. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, we are promised, and we know that all things work together for good to them who love God and are called according to His purpose. In Proverbs chapter 3, beginning in verse 5, we are told, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. We may not understand, but we are promised that if it is our goal to serve and to follow and to please the Lord, that He will direct us every step of the way. My friends, now is not the time to retreat, to wring our hands and to give up. The apostles didn't retreat into their sanctuaries and complain about the violence and the evil in the world around them. They went out and interacted with the people. They demonstrated to them the love of Jesus Christ. They showed them one by one the love of the Lord and how Jesus could make a difference in their lives. They claimed the promise that the gates of hell would not stand against them, and they went out and stormed the halls of hell. And they fought the hounds of hell, and they saved countless people from hell. And the world complained, these folks are turning this place upside down. Paul and the apostles were not playing not to lose, they were playing to win. They weren't gathered together remembering the good old days. They were remembering whose they were and who was in charge. They remembered the promise, greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world. And they went out and won people to Christ, one by one. Right now, my friend, there are more people living than there's ever been in the history of the world. Right now, you can reach and impact people all over the world from your living room. We need to remember that God is still in control. That we are still soldiers in His army, serving the King who is still on the throne. The God who is still in charge. As Mordecai asked Esther, who knows? Perhaps you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this.